The room burst into applause as my father placed the keys to the family house into my sister's hands. Sarah accepted them with a satisfied smile, wearing the expression of someone who believed the victory was already hers. The house, the savings, the investments, it all appeared to belong to her now. I remained seated quietly at the far end of the conference table while relatives exchanged sympathetic glances in my direction. For years, everyone had assumed I was the forgotten daughter. Even Sarah looked at me as though I should feel thankful for whatever leftovers were still available. Then Dad's attorney cleared his throat and reached for one last envelope that nobody in the room even knew existed. In an instant, every smile disappeared. My name is Emily Carter, and I was 34 years old when my father handed my sister the keys to a house that should have changed both of our lives forever. Looking back now, I believe everyone in the family already knew how that day was supposed to end. Everyone except me. My younger sister Sarah had always been the favorite. It wasn't obvious in the beginning. My parents never actually said it aloud. They never needed to. Whenever Sarah earned A's and B's at school, they praised her for working so hard. When I brought home straight A's, it was simply what everyone expected. When Sarah changed her college major 3 different times, my parents admired her adventurous spirit. When I carefully mapped out my career and worked my way up through promotions, they described me as practical. Sarah was the exciting one. I was the dependable one. Somehow, dependable never seemed to earn applause. By the time we reached adulthood, the pattern was impossible to miss. Sarah lived life loudly. She took expensive vacations, replaced her car every few years, and constantly filled social media with pictures of what looked like the perfect life. Meanwhile, I worked as a financial consultant, paid every bill on time, invested carefully, and helped my parents whenever they needed me. Especially Dad. About 3 years before he passed away, his health slowly began to decline. At first, nothing seemed too serious. He would miss an appointment, forget to return a phone call, little things that were easy to overlook. Then those little things became bigger ones: doctor appointments, hospital visits, physical therapy sessions. Throughout all of it, Sarah was almost always too busy. She always had an excuse. Work deadlines, weekend getaways, networking events. Dad never complained. Not even once. If he felt disappointed, he kept those feelings to himself. So I drove him to every appointment. I organized all of his medications. I handled paperwork that kept piling up. I repaired whatever needed fixing around the house. Every single Sunday, without fail, I brought lunch and spent the afternoon with him. I didn't do those things because I expected anything in return. I did them because he was my father. Even so, I won't pretend it never hurt whenever he defended Sarah. She's still finding herself, he'd always say. She means well. Just give her time. And I did. I gave her time. Years of it. Then 8 months before he passed away, Dad asked both of us to come to the family house, the same beach house our grandparents had bought decades earlier. That home held nearly every family memory we had. Summer barbecues, Christmas mornings, birthday celebrations. It wasn't simply a piece of property. It was part of our family's history. That afternoon, Dad stood on the deck overlooking the water while the strong wind rattled the wooden railings. "I want both of you girls to remember something," he said quietly. "Money comes and goes." Sarah barely looked up, glancing down at her phone instead. I listened carefully. Character is what remains. At the time, I didn't think much about those words. Months later, they would mean everything. Dad passed away peacefully the following spring. The funeral was one of the hardest days of my life. Despite everything, I loved him deeply. The weeks that followed passed in a blur, as though life had slowed without ever actually stopping. Then came the estate meeting, the day I believed everything was about to change. The attorney's office was located on the top floor of a downtown building, with a conference room that overlooked the city skyline. Sarah arrived dressed in an expensive designer outfit, carrying enough confidence to fill the entire room. Several relatives had already gathered, us aunts, uncles, and 2 cousins. Everyone knew Dad had been financially successful. What nobody knew was just how successful. Mr. Reynolds, the attorney, welcomed everyone before opening a thick folder. "Thank you all for coming," he said. The room immediately fell silent. He began reading through the will. There were several charitable donations, a handful of personal gifts, and then he moved on to the major assets. With every paragraph, I noticed Sarah sitting a little straighter, almost as though she was waiting for one particular moment. Finally, Mr. Reynolds looked up. "The beach house shall transfer in full ownership to Sarah Carter." Sarah's lips curled into a smile almost instantly. There it was, not a smile of happiness, a smile of victory, the kind someone wears when they're convinced they've beaten everyone else. Several relatives exchanged glances. A few turned toward me with sympathetic expressions, as though they expected me to be heartbroken. Mr. Reynolds placed the brass house keys on the table in front of Sarah. She picked them up without hesitation and actually twirled them around one finger. Then she looked straight at me. She didn't say a single word. She didn't have to. The smirk on her face was the same one she'd worn for years whenever life rewarded her once again. Dad's favorite daughter had won. At least, that was what everyone in the room believed. Mr. Reynolds continued reading several smaller asset distributions, but my attention had drifted elsewhere. Something didn't feel right. The meeting wasn't ending. The attorney still had several documents sitting in front of him. More importantly, beside the folder rested a sealed envelope that hadn't been mentioned even once. I watched him carefully place the final page of the will aside. Sasa stood up. "Well," she said proudly while raising the keys, "I guess Dad made his wishes pretty clear." A few relatives gave awkward nods. Then Mr. Reynolds cleared his throat. Actually, the room froze. Sarah slowly lowered herself back into her chair. The attorney reached for the sealed envelope, and his entire expression changed. "This," he said as he held it up, "contains your father's final instruction." Just like that, every smile in the room vanished. Mr. Reynolds carefully turned the envelope over in his hands. For a long moment nobody spoke. The confidence Sarah had displayed only seconds earlier seemed to weaken ever so slightly. "What's that?" she finally asked. Adjusting his glasses, Mr. Reynolds answered. "This envelope contains a personal letter your father instructed me to read only after the will had been completed." The room became even quieter. Then he broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter, Dad's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. Mr. Reynolds began reading aloud. "If you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and Sarah has already received the beach house." Sarah smiled again, for about 3 seconds, then the letter continued. "Before anyone celebrates or feels disappointed, there are things you deserve to know." I felt my stomach tighten. For many years, I watched both of my daughters make choices. Some choices were loud, were quiet, some impressed people. Others went completely unnoticed. Nobody in the room made a sound. Sarah always loved being seen. Emily never cared who was watching. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Mr. Reynolds continued reading. "When my health began to fail, I learned something important. The people who say they love you and the people who prove they love you are not always the same." I lowered my eyes to the tables. Suddenly, memories came rushing back. Every Sunday lunch, every doctor's appointment, every late-night phone call. Emily drove me to appointments. Emily handled paperwork. Emily repaired things around the house. Emily stayed with me when I couldn't sleep. My eyes began to sting. I hadn't expected any of this, not after spending years feeling invisible. Across the table, Sarah stared silently at the letter. Sarah visited when it was convenient. Emily showed up when it was necessary. The words weren't cruel, if anything, that made them even more powerful. They were simply the truth. Mr. Reynolds paused for a brief moment before continuing. "For 3 years, I paid close attention. I watched who asked how I was feeling, and who asked what would happen to the house. Several relatives exchanged uneasy glances. Sarah folded her arms tightly. Several people may not know this, but Sarah repeatedly encouraged me to transfer my assets early." Sarah's face immediately turned bright red. "Dad never said that," she interrupted. Mr. Reynolds calmly lifted one hand. "The letter will be read in full." Sarah didn't say another word.